So, hi everyone. I'm happy to have Ian Charles Stewart and Pascal Eichenberger on this new episode of our podcast. It's going to be a very interesting discussion. We were thinking to do it in French since all of us speak in French, but we decided for a better reach and to push the entrepreneur based in France and Switzerland to start learning English if it's not already the case. So, Ian, I'm a big fan of your work. We've met a couple of months ago at your IMD founder podcast. So you are also a host. So this time you will be asked a question, not tough question, just like trying to get to know you a bit more and also your vision about the future. So I've prepared with Pascal a couple of questions that I'll be happy to
a couple,
like a few. But welcome to the show.
Thank you, Youness and Pascal. Nice to be here. Always happy to support the entrepreneurship community in Switzerland.
Thank you. So when I first met you, it was like a kind of a very interesting meeting. So we were having like a drink after the podcast, and we had this casual conversation. And I remember, and I even told to my wife when I went back at home that I was kind of destabilized by your type of question. So Jan is a very direct person with kind of tough question, and I think this is kind of traits that you recognize in entrepreneurs. And today we'll be like discussing your entrepreneurial journey. And for those who still don't know you, so I will describe you as a pioneer, a visionary who didn't just predict the future, but you created it with Wired magazine, the first ever online tech magazine that you launched in the 90s. And we know even today, like a large media group, they still struggle to digitalize their businesses. And you did it like almost 30 years ago. So I think it's the best way to introduce you is to let you give us some details about you, and happy to listen.
Okay, so I guess the first thing to say is that for young entrepreneurs listening to this or watching this, don't follow my journey. My life has been full of zigging and zagging. I chose directions based on interest and based on people. I've never got involved in a project because I thought it would make money. I always got involved in a project because it either spoke to me as something that would be fun to do, interesting to try, or it was because I really enjoyed the people, even if I wasn't sure where they were going. And that's been my choice all the way through. That is not the best way to get rich quickly. It is, on the other hand, not a bad way to have a fulfilling life. If you're going to have to work for 3 or 4 or 5 weeks in a row, every weekend until 4 a.m, trying to get a product or a service out the door, it's better that you're doing either something you love or with people you love. It's not that you can't do it if it's just work. It's just that it makes it easier if you're actually enjoying the time you spend with those people at those hours. So Wired was a fun project. I should probably say my background is, again, as odd as my path. I did mathematics, particle physics, and computer science at university. And I started quite young. I got into university at 15. And the only reason I then spent 10 years as a photographer, which was my 20s, was that there were no girls in the maths department. And so the only way to meet the fairer sex was to often take photos. And because my father was a journalist, I'd been taking photos since I was about 6 or 7 years old. So I was competent with a camera at that time. And I got work into the local papers and local magazines, and I was helping friends get their model and actor portfolios together. So that was my life while I was studying maths, particle physics, computer science, which means I had a sensitivity to the aesthetics of publishing really early. And again, as I said, my father was a New York Times journalist based in Hong Kong, one of the early China watchers, president of the Foreign Correspondence Club and all that sort of stuff. So after university, 10 years as a photographer, published my own books, created a book company to do it, then went to business school. very soon after I stopped taking pictures, while I was doing my MBA in Switzerland at IMD, Jane was introduced to me by a friend of mine. Actually, it was a friend of mine who knew Jane's sister. And then Jane was introduced to me by this mutual friend who worked in the publishing sector in Paris. And then Lewis and Jane at that time were just building a new magazine called Language Technology. And Language Technology was talking about machine translation and very early concepts of what became AI, but we at the time were still calling machine learning. And I found that lots of fun. And although the magazine sold not very many copies, a few thousand a month, it was very cool. The attitude that Lewis, who was the founder of Wired and the main protagonist, and it was his idea and his drive, the journalistic style, the writing style, was exactly what you saw in Wired a few years later, because this was 5 years before we launched Wired, right? Language Technology became Electric Word became Wired. But the reason it was interesting is because Lewis had the approach that this wasn't just fun technology, but he automatically thought about how it would carry forward and change things. And he very early saw that technology was going to have a much bigger impact than people were expecting. So the magazine expanded from Language Technology to Electric Word because it incorporated digital publishing, digital desktop publishing at that time, before it was the internet. Then we started spending time with FTP, and when HTML came along, hypertext markup language developed by the people at CERN, just between Geneva and France, we realized that something interesting was going to happen. The idea of connecting documents, we already knew there was an international network. The internet existed at the time. But connecting documents with hypertext so that a document had a series of words and then a phrase or a word in a document could then link you to a document on a different computer in a different country and then be linked back again. That already suggested to us at the time, Lewis and I had been talking since the early days. So the gestation of Wired took 5 years before we launched. It was 5 years of talking about the magazines and evolving the magazines and thinking about where it would go and thinking about what it might talk about. We could already see that this web of connections between documents on top of the international network, the internet that existed at the time, mostly academic institutions and then to a degree private corporations already starting, although they started mostly with file transfer protocol, which is a way to search documents or get documents from another computer in another country, usually for research. That World Wide Web of documents created on top of the international network, the internet, we could see as democratizing access to knowledge, democratizing access to information. And we started to think about what that might mean, where it would go. And we were starting to have, what's that bulging mind icon emoji and on Apple computers now? That's how we felt at the time. And so we had to write about it. The trick was, and this is a reminder for all entrepreneurs, just because we could see it didn't mean anybody else could. And just because we could see the cool things that are happening in technology, no one wanted to invest in us to talk about them. If we had tried to do a tech startup in the early 90s, we would have had no trouble getting money. And in fact, people we would go to talk about investing in the magazine would tell us, no, do the thing you're talking about and we'll give you the money. We're not interested in funding a magazine. Magazines don't make money. You know, they're too expensive, too hard, and all the rest. So we really struggled, and yet we knew we had to launch. So Lewis and Jane were living in Amsterdam, and I was living in Switzerland, in London. They moved to San Francisco. We started hustling around San Francisco, and then 2 years there trying to get attention to people and showing people what we did. We finally launched in January 1993 with barely enough money raised to pay for the first issue. And in fact, I don't know if people know, but we're a monthly magazine. We only got 5 issues out that first year. Because once we'd spent all our money on the first issue, we had no money for the second. So we were running around hustling, trying to find, and because we had an issue by then, because we actually had a magazine, it was easier to try and get the second round, but not much. I mean, we raised $250,000 for the first issue. We raised another $680, I think, $1,000 to get the next few issues out. And at the end of the year, I was able to make a connection to Cy Newhouse, the owner of Condé Nast at the time. Cy is sadly passed now, who then invested in the magazine properly. So we only got proper investment to take us forward at the end of that first year in 1993. But the magazine took off because although to get it funded, no one was interested, everybody we talked to was interested in what we were saying. So they were all happy to be readers. And we had very little money in the bank. We were lucky we had subscription checks coming through the post every week, and I mean thousands of them, and each of them was for $40. So that's thousands of dollars, $40,000, $50,000 coming through every week, more or less, and that helped fund the magazine while we tried to raise all the money. That's unusual, by the way. In the United States, because it's a big country and everything's large, the stores for magazines are very wide, right? So it's bookshelves and magazine shelves everywhere. You don't need to subscribe. You can just walk down and choose what you want off the shelf. In Europe, subscriptions are much higher. Why? Because the magazine stores are much smaller. There's no space. Real estate is expensive. So they don't carry everything, and they won't carry new magazines. So the only way to get a new magazine is if you subscribe. In the States, for some reason, because there was enough interest and demand, and we'd been talking about it for a while with people over a couple of years in the US, there was enough demand that actually we got subscription checks through the post every week, and that saved us before we could raise proper money and get it going. But that was the beginning of Wired, and Wired was never a technology magazine per se. It was a magazine that was trying to explain to everybody, although at the beginning it was just people interested, but then it became everybody, what impact the technology would have on our lives, what impact the internet would have on our lives. I think one of Lewis's famous phrases was, "It's going to sweep through our lives like a Bengali typhoon." I mean, that was kind of the way he wrote. And that was what made the magazine the success it was. We won awards, all sorts of things happened. Ultimately, 5 years later, Condé Nast, who had invested in us, bought the magazine from us. And then we sold the digital bits because sadly it was split up. The way things worked out, we actually sold the digital and the magazine separately, which we thought was nuts, but it was the way the market was at the time. Because we were getting towards the end of the 90s and we can see this ridiculously high overvaluation of companies, we knew we had to sell before it was too late. And so the two bits of the business was sold separately. Later on, we were involved in helping Condé Nast buy back the digital bits, so the two bits came together again, but that was after we'd sold. But that was Wired. That was the gestation of Wired. And it never felt like a day's work. The whole time felt like tremendous fun. Great team, really lovely people, really interesting project at a really interesting time.
Can you say you are a kind of influencer for all this tech optimist back in that time? Because a couple of weeks ago I was listening to a podcast from A16s,
Yep.
and Ben Horowitz was mentioning that he was a reader of Wired, and so since your tagline is kind of, as you mentioned, democratizing information. So I feel that you are just more than someone who built a media online, but you inspired a lot of people and democratize access to information.
So that's what people say, and it's lovely to hear it. I mean, it's still nice to hear it 35 years later. Ben, Mark Andreessen, and others have said that Wired got them excited about it. I mean, they were already working on the technology. I mean, Mark was at the, Andreessen was at the National Center for Supercomputing of America in Chicago, which was where Mosaic was developed, which eventually became Netscape, the first web browser. So Mozilla, Mosaic, Netscape, and so on. And so they were aware of the tech, but it took, I guess, the magazine and our approach to it, and very specifically Lewis's way of thinking about the world, which is always forward and able to extrapolate in interesting directions. It was the way the magazine talked about what technology would do, which seemed to fire people up. It got the people who were already working on stuff, like Mark Andreessen, more excited, which was nice. But it also got a lot of other people who weren't yet excited about it, aware of what was going on, and that brought attention to it. So a number of people have said that we acted as an instigator, an influencer, a focuser of attention on the burgeoning technology space in general, in the days when influencer meant something real. That became a part of our legacy, which we're very proud of and was a ton of fun.
We often got this conversation with Pascal about setting up in the US, the differences between Europe, Switzerland, and the US market, and also you have like a bold opinion about that. And you did it yourself. You were based in Europe, and you wanted to launch Wired in San Francisco. So why we shouldn't be setting up in Europe? Take it as you like.
So I'm going to get in trouble for this. I guess there's a couple of things. First of all, there's an obvious thing. The United States is now 300 plus million, at the time 275 million people who speak more or less the same language, more or less. And it's therefore a relatively uniform market. And so if you're going to start something, it's easier to aim into a market with the same branding, the same marketing message, the same distribution system for 275 million people rather than 50. So having a bigger market is already a good idea. The second thing is that there was no question that at that time, and still today, and we're going to come back to ask why still today, when we can see what's happening. At that time, all of the interesting developments were happening in the US. All of them, Minitel notwithstanding in France, which was kind of a stunted, lovely idea, but didn't work well. Everything was happening of interest in the US, right? And so we knew we had to be in the center of it. San Francisco was easy. Sand Hill Road was already the home of venture capitalists. It was already the home of major technology companies. And if they weren't there, they were just up the road in Seattle, right? So it was possible to already see a center of gravity for what was going to take place in technology and both global business and global consumer lives from there. So we had to be there. But there's also a third reason, and this is the reason that gets me into trouble, but I'm afraid it's true. If you wish to start a company on continental Europe, I still consider the UK part of Europe, even though it's no longer part of the EU. But on continental Europe, the hassle you have to go through, the costs you have to go through, the regulation that prevents doing some of the things you'd like to do, to set up a company, to hire people, to fire people, because you have to get, as a startup, you hire quickly because you've got to find people. People don't realize how hard it is to get people to join a startup. No one wants to take a risk on a company that may go bust in 6 months. So hiring good people is really hard. So you hire who you can, but then some people don't work out. So you've got to get rid of them quickly. Well, you try to get rid of people quickly in France or Germany, right? Even if they've only been there 6 months. So the regulations and costs of doing business in Europe, all designed with good intentions to help people, are awful for generating new entrepreneurship. So it's all those three reasons together, which means that the US, potentially China if you're Chinese, is still the best place to build a business where you have a unique single market. You can try things out and build. Lots of competition, so you better be good. Relatively straightforward legislation. Very bright, well-educated people you can hire, some of whom come in from overseas to try and live and work in the United States. So it's a great place to build a team. And then also, of course, access to capital. The two places with strongest access to capital today are China and the US still. So if you have a halfway decent idea and you're able to explain it clearly, and if your team is believable and coherent, because remember, we all invest based on the team more than the idea, then you'll have no trouble raising money in the US. The people who complain that they can't raise money, it's because there's something wrong with either them or the project. I hear complaints from people all the time that it's raising money is difficult, but I also hear complaints all the time from fellow investors saying, can't find a project worth investing in. So in the US, if you've got a decent project, it's not hard to raise capital. That's why we went to the US. It had to be in the US because of the center of gravity of everything happening on the internet. It had to be in the US because of geographics and demographics of a potential marketplace, but also because it was just easier. It was just easier, and it still is.
So it's very interesting what you were saying, and you were mentioning when you started Wired, you got some difficulties to raise funds and a lot of friction because the idea was so new that it was difficult for people to understand. And also, and this is something very interesting for us as European people living here. You don't get often the chance to listen to an entrepreneur, a successful entrepreneur, who is saying that it was hard, it was tough. Usually, the culture want us to say, "Oh no, it was easy. It was very straightforward." And this is the cultural aspect of Europe. So, do you think that really, if you have like a good idea, you are a smart person, you should be trying in Europe, or you should go directly to the US without thinking? And it's really about this quote from Peter Drucker: "Culture eats strategy for breakfast."
I agree with that. I agree with that totally. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. But there are parameters within which you need to make decisions, right? So work permits are an issue. Your own capital is an issue. Whether you can develop the product or service of the team you already have, if you're in France or you're in Germany or in Switzerland, what your cost base is. Are you having to pay for everything, or is everybody working part-time while they're trying to build something on the side of their main job? The parameters matter. at some stage, if you're a B2C, especially, B2B less so, but if you're a business to consumer business and you're looking for mass market and you need rapid growth, then you're probably better off outside Europe. Now, there are exceptions. In Europe, the three easiest places to generate capital and build a business that's partly technology-based, especially if you can reach people online. If it's physical and you have to transport things, no. But if it's a virtual business, so it's software and or a hardware business where there's a big online component, then England, the UK, Ireland, and Amsterdam, Switzerland, Holland, have the best environments here in that order. Amsterdam's the best place on the continent. England's the easiest place by far in terms of access to capital and access to people and access to easy structuring for companies, and also being able to move and change things very quickly. That's still the case. The Anglo-Saxon legal system is just easier than some of the stuff that came out of French origins or German origins. But you can start here. I'm down at Fongit a lot, the incubator in Geneva, and we have companies there that start here because the team happens to be here and they know each other and they're fine and they can actually build an initial market just to test whether people actually want to buy it and use it. I think one of the problems in Switzerland is it's quite easy to raise startup capital from grants, right? So you can survive. I've seen teams that have survived 3 or 4 years at Fongit and elsewhere, the other incubators or even independently in Switzerland, who've never talked to a customer because they can get this 50,000 here, 100,000 here, 40,000 here. And that's the worst way to build something. You know, I talk to them and say, you know, do they come to me for investment or advice or something? And I say, so what does your customer think? You know, how's your first product working? And they go, we haven't talked to a customer yet. And I say, how long have you been doing this? 4 years. They're perfecting the product. It's if you don't have customers telling you what's wrong with it, you don't improve your product. So you do need to get out there, even with no money and even with a prototype, and even if it's really, really bad, talk to customers, have people try it out, even if the customers are friends, because that's how your product gets better. Now you can do that here. You can do that here. You
can mess around for a long time
and then go abroad. Sorry, say again, Youness?
I was saying you can mess around for a long time because you get grants from,
It's too easy to raise that grant money here, yeah. And then it's harder, by the way, to raise the proper Series A venture money. You've got angel money here, you've got grant money here. Series A venture, which is the third stage usually in a startup's financial life, is harder because, again, because we don't have the market here and therefore the venture capitalists don't set up here. B2C consumer anything is almost impossible to fund. There you have to leave. So that's access to capital unless you have friends or family who can fund it for you. What you can find here is biotech, medtech, fintech. I know people on the venture side for those 3 sectors, and that's about it. So access to capital also becomes a criteria. And why is the capital not here? It's because they don't believe the market's big enough, which should tell you something, right? So if you're building something in one of those that's not in one of those 3 spaces, then you probably need to look for both market and capital somewhere else. Now, if you don't want to go to the US or you have work permit issues or for whatever reason you can't go that far, then UK is the best stepping stone for anybody trying to build a B2C product in Europe. Test it here, develop, progress to the point where you need the next stage, move to London.
And why do you think that the market is too fragmented? You know, it's very difficult to build a cluster. You have a lot of things, but they do it alone. So and also when we had the first discussion, you get a lot of I don't know if we can say this online, but let's see. You can decide to not respond, but you have a lot of corporate people involved into entrepreneurship, which even themselves, they have never been in entrepreneurship, never built anything, you know, and then they start giving like advice when if you move to the US, you might have access to Y Combinator or for other incubator with people who have been there and who have done it, you know.
So that's I'm afraid a truth of the environment here. Now, again, you do have good people. I was actually exchanging messages with a fellow who I won't name, who's a fellow entrepreneur, different company, did well, moved here 20 years ago. He's a big angel investor in Switzerland. I think he won Angel Investor of the Year one year, 35 investments in 1 year. I said he was nuts. How are you going to deal with the board meetings of 35 companies in a year? Just anyway, but there are people like that here, right? I'm here, he's here. There are people in Geneva. Fongit has a founder in the director team. So there are people who've built companies. there are more people who've never built companies. So when I came back from China, where I was building social ventures, and I wanted my family to understand what China was like and learn the language and get to know my kids. When we came back, I was pointed to ETH in Zurich and EPFL here, and I went to the entrepreneurship parks that sit around or built around the area. And as I recounted to you when we had tea, it was full of lawyers and accountants and bankers and former corporate people who've never built anything before. And I like the fact that they're interested in the space. It's cool that they want to help, but generally they're charging for it, which is hard for small startups that have no cash. And secondly, as you say, they've never done it. They don't know what it's like to get the first customer. They don't know what it's like to get someone to rent them a building when they've never done anything before and they're 2 kids. There's a lot of things about getting your first product done, your first customer signed, your first check through the post, your first bank account, all of that stuff. It's just a particular way of doing business. And if you haven't done it, it's hard to help. So I think that's an issue here. But it's not just Switzerland, it's Europe-wide. There's something funny about the water in Switzerland and Europe. I have friends who've done well and made money, and the last thing they want to do is go join a GP of a venture firm, right, to help other young entrepreneurs. Whereas everybody I know who makes money in the US ends up either at least an LP with a phone line or a member of the GP. So these are general partner, limited partner venture firms where you go for your first serious financing. You tend to do friends and family around, then it's angel in the environment, and then you go to your Series A at a venture firm. The GP is the managing partner group who are active, involved in making investments. The LP limited partners are people who put money in, but generally aren't involved, although some able LPs will allow a phone number to be given to the GPs in case there's an issue which needs experience from their particular sector and they can get called up. So in the US, everybody who makes money is related to a venture firm afterwards in some form, whether passive or active. In Europe, everybody goes to the beach. I don't understand that. Again, there are exceptions. I'm being slightly sarcastic, but it is true. It's not as common. And I think it's partly because the venture firms have for some time in the US been staffed with people who know how to do it. The venture firms in Europe are generally staffed by investment bankers and accountants. So they're not necessarily the people you want to hang out with once you've sold your company in Europe. Whereas in the US, they are people like you. If you pitch a technology firm and you go to the right company, and by the way, please don't pitch a technology startup to a company that only invests in consumer products. You've got to do your research on who the investors are before you go in. But if you've done your research, you know what they invest in, you know what their bite size is, it matches what you want to do, and you go in and do a pitch, typically the guys and gals on the other side of the table know as much, if not more, than you do about your market. Right? That's why venture works in the US. It's because of the quality of people who are investors, because they've done it themselves. Typically here, as I said, it's lawyers, accountants, and investment bankers. So they don't have the same experience, and they're less fun to hang out with.
And how do you handle the no's? You know, how do you handle this friction when people they are telling you no, it's not a good idea, but you keep pushing? You know,
ask why. Most people in Europe, again, and they're super polite. You said it earlier on. I'm pretty direct. That's because I'm not British. I'm a New Zealander. I'm a Kiwi. I'm an Antipodean. We tend to be blunt. I've learned to arrondir les ongles, as my wife says. I've learned to be gentler, but I'm pretty blunt. And therefore, if someone comes to me, and I did this even when I was running the Pearson Media Fund in the UK, my first fund before I went to Rothschild afterwards, I will tell people why it doesn't work for us. Most people don't want to do that because they don't want to see the people again. They don't want an excuse to come back. They say, no, sorry, not for us. And they don't say why. I will say why. You've got a hole in your management team. I don't believe this technology will work. I haven't seen a prototype. I will tell them exactly why, because that means they can improve and come back. And I want them to improve and come back. Why am I a mentor now when I don't need to do this anymore? I like seeing people succeed. I like seeing people do things they don't realize they can do. I like helping people. My wife is a teacher. She thinks I should have been a teacher. That's why I do mentoring at IMD and spend time there. I want people to do well, also because it changes the world, right? If you help people do cool things, that becomes cool for all of us. But that isn't how most venture firms react in Europe. They say, no, thank you, and you walk away. So you learn nothing. So if someone says no, find out why and listen, right? Maybe it's the greatest idea since sliced bread, but maybe you've forgotten something, or maybe your team's not believable, or maybe you have no background, or maybe you have no commitment. There's always something. So if someone's saying no, find out why. Now, Every now and then, especially in Europe, you'll get investors who have no clue. Fine, go to another investor. But at least ask. The fundraising process, it's not rocket science. It's a process. And it's doing your best and modifying and adjusting along the way, taking the feedback where you can. I told you it took 5 years to get Wired Magazine launched, right? We had some support at different times. We sold a few copies of Language Technology and Electric Word. But we were knocking on doors and telling people about this, even when we moved to the US. From moving from Amsterdam to the US to launching in January 1993, I think it was almost 2 years of talking to people about the magazine. Every time we talk to someone, we learn something. It gets better. The project gets better, right? You know, some of the input's not useful, but almost always you get something. So if you go talk to smart people about your project, you'll learn stuff. It's a great way to get free help.
So you got to be curious, and when I look at your background, and we had this discussion this morning with Pascal about Steve Jobs, and it reminds me of a book, The Medici Effect, where they looked at the breakthrough innovation in the Renaissance period. So you had a lot of people with different background, artists, and this is what brought you to launch all these very successful ventures, because you are also behind BBC News Online, the FT.com, and now at IMD. So this is this mathematician background, photographer background that has helped you?
I think so. I describe it as being a T person, right? Like the letter T. I think it's easier today, especially when there's so much change going on, to do well if you have a deep understanding of something, but at least some understanding of everything else. Otherwise, you don't know where this fits. And the best teams are teams where 3 or 4 people are all like this, and they have different verticals. Because that way they're able to understand markets, understand investors, understand competitors, understand the macro environment in which they're working in. For that reason, you can imagine, I'm not fond of teams of people who are PhDs, right? They tend to be very narrow and have no understanding of the rest of the world. And they just think that because the technology works, it's going to work. But they don't know how to sell it. They don't know who would buy it. They don't know how to price it. They don't know who the competitors are. They don't know where it fits in to the life cycle of companies or individuals they're trying to sell to. So yeah, I think it's important to be a generalist today. It wasn't always the case, right? So at the beginning of the automobile, when there were, people forget, turn of the 1900s to 1920s, there were 3,000 car companies in the US, and most of them failed. And it wasn't the first ones that survived. Because once you knew what the market was and you knew what the product was, then you could refine. But when you're in a time like now, where there's so many things going on, and people have forgotten about 3D printing, but 3D printing is super cool, right? Super fast and inexpensive prototyping means that the hardware stuff is moving along at a much faster pace than it has in, I don't know how long, ever, I think. So the multitude of different developments in different sectors taking place right now mean that you can do better if you understand a little bit about everything that's going on. So I think that is crucial at a time of great change in many areas. And as others have said, the last time something like this happened was really the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, when you had electricity, the telephone, and the automobile all within the same 25-year span. And that transformed the world. You think about the way the world looked prior to those things. Candles in houses, no communication, mail that took months, horse and buggy in the carts, and flash forward to telephones and companies, at least later in homes, electricity everywhere, inexpensive, decent light, no candles, no risk of fire, and then cars for almost everybody at extraordinarily cheap prices, where you didn't have to feed it all the time, not the same way. No, the world was transformed in that period. We're going through something like that now. And so it's easier if you have some sense of everything that's going on for context for your thing you want to do.
That's so much, very insightful. So many thanks for that. I mean, I'm just like hard time speaking because I'm a bit blown away. Thanks for sharing. Just a question, my feeling, I'm an engineer by training. And, I'm just going to quote Eric Schmidt to give me, some confidence about what I say, but I truly stand by those words. He said recently that that's the strongest environment I've ever seen in my entire life by an order of magnitude in terms of innovation and reinvention of markets. I'm not only talking about like building a new large language model, but just like, attacking Salesforce and so on and so on, so many verticals. And I started two startups because I was like, this time I'm going to go on because that's too exciting, could not resist, right? And I feel as well that with LLM and Cursor and all those things, you need a bit less capital, at least in the early stage. So you comment about like this early funding and those grants enables people to kind of like invent the world, right? And as you say, I subscribe to that. Technology is driving the world, truly, much more than ideas, I think. Because if you don't have light, you can't study in the evening. So, it defines a lot of what we are. So would you agree with Schmidt that that's just going to be a new era, and that so many things are going to get reinvented with 3D printing? I'm just okay. It's not only about AI, but to me, the fact we can store knowledge and access to agents you can talk to and they can program whatever you want. That seems so groundbreaking to me. I feel like we are back in the wired era back again.
I have to say I agree. I sit down at lunch with the MBAs at IMD, and within 10 minutes of starting to chat with them, I forget that I'm twice their age. And I really wish I was 30-something again, because it is very much the 90s all over again. The excitement, the optimism, the potential, access to capital, number of companies starting. And it's actually easier because the world is definitely more international. The fact that the internet is there means our communication capability is stronger. I would say what you said about ideas and tech in a slightly different way, but I agree with the premise. I just say it slightly differently. I would say that ideas are now a dime a dozen. It's very easy to see everybody's ideas because the internet allows communication, and people talk. People now talk. And if someone goes to a meeting, they hear about something, they talk about it, and it flows. So yes, ideas are easier to come by. It's less the tech now and more the execution capability. So not only do you have the technology that can underpin a process that you develop to attack a market, but you also need to be absolutely certain you can build a process involving people and sourcing and cost structure and convincing customers to try you out. Because the hardest thing when you're new, especially if you're doing B2B, if you're a small company trying to sell to big companies, is they don't trust you. And their job is on the line. If they make a mistake and they invest in your product and it fails, they lose their job, and that's everything to them. So finding a way to get that first sale is a trick. So I think it is execution as a whole, not just the tech. So for engineers, and I have a lot of friends who are engineers, and I did engineering as part of obviously my undergraduate. You've got to try and learn as much as you can about marketing, finance, and business as you can to work out the process building side of the business beyond product development. And as long as you can do that, if you can execute, you'll do fine. Whether you get bought out or whether you sell out, whether you are taken out by a competitor, but you've learned along the way so the next company gets better. There's a magazine in the US. It's not a great magazine, but it is a magazine we don't have in Europe, which is it's a magazine for startups. It's called Inc. magazine, INC. I assume it still exists. I haven't picked up a copy in 20 years, but Inc. is a magazine. They called it Inc. because when you create a company in the United States, it's an INC, it's an incorporated vehicle. Here it would be limited, LTD or something like that. And it's lots of stories about how entrepreneurs did things. So that's why it's super useful. It's the how they did it. What we're doing, Youness, with the Founder Series is the same thing. Startups are hard, and 99% fail. Even 95% of well-backed venture startups, maybe they don't fail, but they don't succeed, right? They stay alive, but they don't do as well as they'd like to. So startups are hard. And we tell at the Founder Series as many stories of failures as successes, so people know what to look out for. Inc. magazine does this in the US, right? It does that by telling stories of stuff that works and stuff that doesn't. Now, every year they do a survey of the Inc. 500, which is the CEOs of the 500 fastest growing companies in the US. It's not actually, because they can't reach all the companies, but it's good representation of it. And it's very interesting that pretty much every year when I was following the magazine, between 57 and 68% of the CEOs were on their third company, and the first two hadn't worked, right? So fastest growing companies in the US, it took 2 companies to learn what to do right. So the third one worked. So I would encourage everybody, if they have this bug in them, as I did, as you do, Pascal, start as soon as you can, because you might as well learn when they can't take anything away from you, right? You don't have a spouse, you don't have school fees, you don't have a house. If you go bankrupt, there's nothing they can take from you. Learn early, start early, do it straight out of university. But, okay, having said that, 40 years ago, when I think I did my first graduation speech for somebody, 35 years ago, early days, it was about 4% of the class was thinking about entrepreneurship. Now, because of all the fuss about the number of billionaires that have come out of nothing, it's like 25 of the class are thinking about it. But that doesn't mean you can do it. It has to be in you. It has to be, you have to have it. It's easier to have a team. You can do it solo, but it's just much easier to have a team. And then you need a halfway decent idea. It doesn't have to be brilliant, because you will change your idea as you develop it. And you need to have access to some capital. If you have those 3 things, a halfway decent idea, a team, and access to capital, then by all means start, even if you're 21. Because whether or not it works, you will learn along the way. You're much more likely to have made your first million before 30 if you start sooner. So I encourage kids to just have a go.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I'm going to send this video to my son, who just started HSC, and he said like, hey, man, if I start a startup, are you with me? And I said, oh, absolutely. Just go ahead. I'm going to back you whatever it takes. And I think it's kind of what we try to do for Youness most of the time in French, because, you know, like people don't learn English, and that's a huge mistake. So again, learn, because you can, I mean, there's most of the insights are in English. So if you're stuck in French, that's a hard sell. But still, we try to carry that in French and Swiss romand, because, you know, why not? That's and we have the truth. We have so much fun doing that every week. Now we do that twice a week. That's so much fun. And I think you said something about becoming a billionaire. In my view, I mean, I would love to do that, but I think it's never why you start.
Right.
I mean, you know, money is a very nice outcome, but your chances, my gut feeling is that your chances of success are much better if you have fun doing it. And it's not only about the money side of things. I mean, you know,
I don't know if your chances of success are higher if you have fun, but your chances of feeling good about the process at the end are definitely higher if you had fun.
Agreed.
Failing, but learning and having fun along the way is actually totally fine in life. Succeeding, but it being a nightmare the whole way, that's exhausting. It's okay. It's nice to have money in the bank, but it doesn't necessarily. I mean, you have a sense of fulfillment, but I agree. It's nicer if you have fun along the way. I also agree totally, of course. Money is not a bad motivator. It is true that more people from disadvantaged backgrounds will do the extra work necessary to get through or over or around a brick wall, because you will hit brick walls in every startup all the time and constantly. So the hungry people are more likely to succeed, but then you need the education in the team. You can't, it's just tough if you don't have other people with you to pick you up when you fall over. And if you don't have enough understanding of both context and product and service to be able to make that trip round or over or through the brick wall. It does take drive, and the people who do it lightly will also quit more quickly. So.
And it reminds me something that we discussed, and I wrote down your words when we had this cocktail at the IMD, and you said entrepreneurship is not that complicated, it's tough. And I agree with you, it's tough, and having this twice a week with Pascal when we discuss, we have fun, but the rest of the time is really the 2 words that you mentioned. It's sell and hustle, sell and hustle, sell and hustle. And this is something that
it is the crucial part of building stuff. Some people have charm, some people have a great product, some people have unlimited access to capital. But if you can't generate a sale, if you can't, and this is not just the product or service. If you're raising money, it's a sell job. If you're trying to hire new people, it's a sell job. Right? No one's going to take a risk if they don't believe in you. You need to know how to communicate. I saw something on Bloomberg recently. It was an interview by Rubenstein, and whoever it was, I think it was the head of a big hedge fund, said that the underrated skill that he looks for when he's hiring people for the hedge fund, it's not even an operating company so much as an investment vehicle, is the ability to communicate well. If you can't encapsulate an idea simply, convey it to people, and by the way, adjust the pitch depending on who you're speaking to. If it's someone with more technical knowledge, you say things differently to someone who's a general investor or a potential customer who doesn't need the technical knowledge. So you change your pitch. You've got to adjust what you say. If you can't communicate in that way, which is the basis for selling, because it's not, selling isn't what a lot of people think it is, which is getting up in front of people's faces and say, buy this, buy this, buy this. It's not what it is. Selling is communication. So the communication skill, I think I think I agree with the hedge fund guy. I think it's certainly one of the, if not the most important skill for anybody trying to succeed in business on their own today. Because without the logo on the business card that you're walking around with, why should they believe you? If you don't have that logo, if it's not known, if you're not known, then everything is in the words that come out of your mouth. Everything is in the way you convey that. Everything is in the way you listen to them and take their feedback and adjust what you say and come back to them. That's how we gain customers, suppliers, employees. It's all about that. So that is selling and hustle. The hustle side is don't stop. The hustle side is just don't stop. It will not surprise you both that I have two daughters. One is an entrepreneur. The other went through the investment banking private equity group and is now looking at starting something. So it's not an uncommon thing. If it's something in the family and you know it's possible, it's not that I instruct them, they've learned themselves. It's that because they know it's possible. So it's easier if you come from a family where they did something, you know that that's real, then you very often pursue that. Without going into too much detail, every startup has struggles. I mean, serious struggles. I mean, it's like hit the wall, go bankrupt, fire everybody type of problems. We all have that. The ability to get through that and find a way through it is what makes the difference often. Not always. Some people have an easier ride, but it often makes the difference between those who succeed and those who don't. It's that extra ability to hustle.
I pretty much agree. I mean, startup is not an easy thing, and I don't want to tell the people who listen, it's just like, that's going to be all beautiful and so on. On the other hand, the flip side of that, I mean, unless you're born rich with 100 million in your bank account, which must be a curse, much more than
it often
than a
is.
grace,
Yeah,
I
it
think.
often is.
But I mean, if we talk to the young audience who listens to us, on the one hand, you can take a corporate job and you're going to learn. You go to investment banking, whatever, engineering, whatever you do. But if you look at like the industry and how it's getting transformed and how it's gonna, all the tertiaire, so the like think about banking, insurance, all those places where you manipulate information. In my view, that's gonna get bloody hell disrupted by AI. And I would much prefer to develop the skills to be an entrepreneur and have like 2-3 legs business. So on the one hand, you give talks, on the other hand, you do that. Then you have a small venture doing XYZ. And I think it's about building resilience. And I mean, like maybe 30 years ago, there was a path to go to a big corporate and there was some kind of a deal, right? You're going to shut up a bit. You're not going to be too much creative, but we're going to stay with you for a few years. I think the deal is gone. I'm just making it black and white for the purpose of the discussion. But to some extent, that deal is pretty much not on the table anymore. If you look at Bosch in Europe, they do equipments for car makers. They just slashed north of 5,000 jobs, and 3,000 of those were for the autonomous car, which means they said, oh, fuck off, autonomous car, it's not for us. We abandoned the boat, we burn our ships. And, I mean, I understand startups, it's very hard, having done some, and failed. But you learn, and I think the world that comes, it's going to be so fluid and so dynamic that, this apparent security you build by joining a big corporate seems to me to be much lower than back in the days, like 30 years ago. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. I do not recommend, well, as I said, it depends to a degree upon how much the processes of entrepreneurship are possible within the individual, right? So someone, a new graduate, 21, 22, there are some people who are naturally able to get up in front of people and talk and try and sell something. There are people who are naturally able to to sell a product and will do everything they can to get in through a door or convince someone to do something. And there are a lot of people, especially today, where we overprotect kids. We spend too much time talking about social issues which have less to do with real issues, that a lot of them don't feel capable of doing something on their own, which is a shame. That's why I encourage sports. I encourage risk-taking as kids. I encourage all sorts of things, because unless they try things and fail and try things and succeed, they don't know it's possible. For those kids, for those graduates, a company is often the only place they can go because they don't know how to do anything otherwise. And what that does is give them relationships and pays a salary. But you're quite right, Pascal. The probability is these days that company's not going to be there very long. The average life on the Fortune 500 and I have the data for the US, it's just easier to quote, but the same will be true in Europe, a little less so, but still. The average life on the Fortune 500 of a company at the turn of the 19th, 20th century was 75 years. Shortly after the Second World War in the 50s, it had already dropped to 48, 45. This is a Harvard study. And now the last time I saw it was 18 years. So companies are lasting less long. There are some that still do well. Oil companies, Coca-Cola, the things that Warren Buffett invests in, he chooses very well. They last longer. But most companies are not surviving at the top as long as they used to. So there is a life cycle to this. But then the process of hiring and firing in a lot of countries is not that bad. So you can have a life going out of your graduate program into a company and working for 3 or 4 years, and maybe the company suffers or fails and you can move on. It's not that there are processes to help people do that. But I do agree that if you're looking for security, you're not less likely to find it in a startup than you are in a big company today because of the rate of change of things. And I do think resilience in the individual is as important as resilience in the company. When I'm involved in building business processes today, I'm not trying to bed something down the way I might have 35 years ago. There needs to be flexibility and adjustability within the business process you set up, because stuff changes too quickly. Supply chains change too quickly. Components change too quickly. Market reactions change too quickly. Who was it? Who was the military strategist who said a battle plan doesn't survive first contact with the enemy? It was a German, Clausewitz. Clausewitz, the guy who did that.
Yeah.
So I always say a business plan doesn't survive first contact with the customer, because it changes, because what you assumed wasn't completely correct. So you need to be able to adjust things along the way, even after you started. So I think you're right on resilience, both in the individual and ability to keep going, but also in the company ability to adjust, because stuff changes at such a high rate. On the AI side, yeah, there's a lot going on, especially on the B2B side. I think a lot of the things that people don't realize is a lot of the early AI machine learning stuff is in stuff we don't see. It's business processes in, as you say, finance and insurance, where AI solutions are solving admin problems. They're getting rid of admin issues. Lawyers are going to struggle because, not because the top partners in the top law firms aren't really useful, because remember, those guys are business people as much as lawyers. But the drafting that's normally done by the juniors, and actually one of the little secrets of the legal profession is that they have what's called boilerplate templates. So they themselves have Word documents, which are basically the same document they sell to every customer all year round for the same thing, with slight adjustments of details. And they still charge the $800 an hour for it. So that stuff is going to get done by AI. And you can now find places on the web to create your first legal documents without having to talk to a lawyer, which is fine for your early stage. When you get professional investors in, then they'll force you to do it properly and have it checked out. But that means that the marginal revenue to the law firms reduces, because a whole bunch of people just won't talk to them anymore. They don't need to until they really, really do need it. I think that's one of the fun things. There is going to be, as I said, it's why we talk about the level of disruption for business and consumer life now probably being as much as was the case around the turn of the 19th, 20th century with the arrival of electricity, telephone, and cars. You don't even have to go back that far to look at it. When I left New Zealand, left Australia, where my parents were at the time, to go off and do my adventures and do my first book on the people of Indonesia, and then my book on shophouse architecture in Singapore, I didn't talk to them for about a year and a half. They didn't know where I was physically. I mean, I had family in Indonesia, so they occasionally heard from them. But a telephone call cost $30 cross country in that time, and you had to book it in advance with the post office. It was super expensive and difficult. And $30 was 2 weeks living expenses at that time. People don't realize how much money falls in value every year. So they had no idea where I was. Now, my youngest daughter is in Australia at the moment. And in fact, she's in Tasmania. And this morning she had a horrible flight where they had to do a fly around because Tasmania is an island in the middle of the Southern Ocean, right at the southern tip of Australia. So it's where the Vendée Globe sailors are heading at the moment. They're sort of full of storms and typhoons. So it's always a hairy flight in. I know that because she sent me a WhatsApp message. And we're getting daily accounts of where she is, which is really cool as parents. And it's nice to be able to share it with her. The world has changed so much just in the last 30 years, just because of mobile communication. It's not just the voice, obviously, it's the apps you have on board. People don't realize how much it's changed. And it's also the detail of it. When I left the office when I was 30 years old, that was it. I was off for the weekend. No one could get hold of me. Right? When you left the office, there was no way for the boss to communicate with you. Now, unfortunately, these kids have to carry their mobile phones on them. And if they're in consulting and investment banking, it's a 24/7 job. Maybe they're not working all 24/7, but they're available all 24/7. And that's rough. So there's good and bad with what's happened. But it is, unless you look back, I think more people should study history, not just history of tech, but history of society in general. They don't realize the degree to which society can transform, how radical it can be in such short periods of time. So now we're doing exactly that, and it's accelerating, right? It's going to be faster, more bouleversant, more clearly different in 5, 10, 30 years' time than at any time in history. And that's fun, as long as you try to ride with.
This is funny to hear this from you, having disrupted an entire industry, the media industry. 30 years ago, and now it's happening again. So we've seen with the US election that a big part of the communication and news have been done through podcast, through x.com. What's your feeling about it? Because you were saying the rate of change is getting higher, and this is the case even in something such important as the US election.
I did an interview last year. We did a public event at IMD, which was well attended, where I interviewed Jessica Sibley, who's the new CEO of Time Magazine. Time Magazine was bought by Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce. And we talked about what it took to be a serious media player today. When instead of being, I remember the days when there were 4 TV stations and 5 newspapers in the UK. Now everybody with a phone is a reporter, right? There are millions of sources of news now. Well, news, but there are millions of sources. So how do you stand out today? How do you get anybody to read your magazine or newspaper, online or offline? And it comes down to trust. And it's very hard. People are so ghettoized in their sourcing of news and information. We know social media algorithms just reinforce that if you like something, they'll just keep giving you more of that. You mentioned BBC News Online, Youness. When we did BBC News Online in 1996, we allowed personalization of the news, but only up to 75%. We left 25% of everything that came in would be what the BBC thought everybody should know. I think X and Meta should be doing that for news sourcing now, so that there is some level of general news that everybody knows. But it may be too late. I just backed a company in Germany. I'm going to come back to answer your question directly in a minute, but I'm talking around it. I backed a company in Germany which is tackling this problem of fake news. And they first thought of trying to prove that their news was neutral, and that it doesn't work. No one believes you if you don't say what you want to hear. They don't believe you. So what they're currently doing, and I'm giving away a little bit the business model here, is triangulation. So every news story that comes out, they will point to, they won't rewrite, they'll just point to the far left, center right, and far right versions of the story. So if you want to know what the truth is, at least you can read the versions yourself and triangulate. And again, it's the company's not going to republish it. It'll just point so you can see the article, or it'll capture it and come across wholesale. And they're doing deals with publishing sources, so it's not stealing the information. And Pascal, back to your point earlier, that's all been done by AI. We don't need editorial people doing that. It's just pattern matching for stories and sourcing. And they'll do this across different languages in different countries. I think that's interesting, and that's why I backed it. Will it succeed? I don't know. But I think it's more likely that if people can read their own sources and then compare other versions of the same story, they'll get a sense of what truth is, not relative truth, which is a nonsense, but absolute truth, at least within the context of an event. And I think that's helpful because people need that. So now back, Youness, to your key point, the core point of your question. The US elections and elections in general, it's Ireland yesterday, and they're all over the world this year. It's I think someone wrote about the fact that this is the highest number of national elections in history all in one year happening, which is in itself interesting. The US elections is a big topic. I don't know where you want me to stop and start, but on the purpose of choices that people make, first of all, it's interesting that the results did not match the polling. And that's because if you're going to vote for someone that you think everybody else thinks is an idiot, you're not going to tell anybody, right? So polling's only accurate if you don't think you're going to be criticized for your answer. Polling becomes inaccurate when you think you're going to be criticized for the answer. Media as a whole has shifted slightly left over the last 30 years. I say this as an objective observer and someone who's been in the media space. That's partly because of the way we raise our children, the way we teach people about how we should be. People should be polite. People should be aware of people's needs and concerns. People should try not to offend. The trouble is that that's resulted in an attitude within media which is not representative of how the average thinks, right? Because people are blunt, people are who they are, people are different. So it's very hard to judge today anything on political issues through traditional means. In 35, 40 years ago, media was in the control of fewer people. But what that meant was there was also less competition. So the editors of these organizations, TV or news, would get rid of the rubbish. So the newspaper might be more left-wing, it would be The Guardian in the UK, or more right-wing, it could be The Telegraph in the UK. Although I'm in New Zealand, I'm using UK examples because it's closer to here. But you got rid of the rubbish. So it was a left-wing view, but it was a sensible, intelligent left-wing view. It was a right-wing view, but it was a sensible, intelligent right-wing view. The garbage disappeared. That doesn't happen anymore. And on social media, it propagates faster because if someone says something which is crazy or outlandish, it's more likely to get copied and sent on, which, by the way, unfortunately, encourages even the serious media to slightly exaggerate their headlines, because otherwise no one will click through. And they only get paid if they click through, right? Advertising rates are now based on click-throughs, not just did someone see my page. When I was involved in selling newspaper advertising or television advertising in the 1980s for the Pearson Group, I could tell people that, my page was worth £27,000 a page, where the Times was at the FT, Financial Times page was worth £27,000 a page, when the Time magazine, Time newspaper in the UK, the Times, owned by Rupert Murdoch at the time, was only £3,000 a page, because I had smarter, higher level C-suite readers. And they accepted that because we did a survey once a year. Couldn't tell them if anybody actually read the article or looked at it or poked at it. Now you can. And because you can, newspapers change their language. So even the traditional well-written stuff exaggerates, pushes, because they need people to click through, otherwise they don't get paid. All of this is a problem, right? The skewing of media, partly by technology, partly by society, is a problem if you're trying to generate a functioning governing system, a functioning governance system. Now, it shouldn't be a problem if you polarize, if everybody's more or less here and you polarize them that way. That's not a problem if you're still trying to find the middle, right? What multi-party politics is about is you've got people over here and people over here, and they get together and they talk out and they compromise and they find something that works. That's fine. But what's happened as people have gotten further and further apart is now they don't talk to each other. They yell at each other. So you don't get compromise, you get one extreme to the other. And Youness, to your answer, my guess is that that's what we get now. We've had one extreme over the last few years in the US. Again, extreme, relatively speaking. The US is generally a more pragmatic place than, say, half the world. But now we're going to go the other way. And what isn't helpful is it's going to be hard to get compromises. And what also isn't helpful is that each side portrays the other side as demons, right? The left considers the right, almost literally demons because of the religious involvement. The right portrays the left as complete idiots because of some of the things that they focus on. Even, by the way, it's interesting, Bernie Sanders, who's obviously far left in the United States, was criticizing the Democratic Party because they lost their core audience, which was the working class in the US, because they focused all their time on social minorities, because that became important to the people, mostly white, by the way, middle class, leading the Democratic Party. And they lost track of the people that they should have been supporting. So it maybe self-criticism will help bring people closer to the center. But all of this, Youness, means that we have a time when we get this oscillation in politics and policy. And that makes it hard for companies to build things because things could rapidly change quickly, and that's troublesome. I will say, just to finish on this, in case you want to, and you can decide where you want to drill down on this, I will say that much of the concern about tariffs from the US for China and Europe, if you've read Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, and you've watched him in his first term, a lot of it's negotiation, right? He pushes big ideas out there that upset people, and that gives him a negotiating stance that he can back away from to get the deal he actually wants. It's just his style. So whilst he definitely wants to be able to put them in, I don't think they'll last long if he does, because he'll try to use that as a way to negotiate back to more sensible terms. So I don't expect the next 4 years to be a disaster the way some of the press do.
I pretty much agree. Just a question on a suggestion for your startup, reinventing the media. One thing I would love, and I'm ready to pay a shitload for that, is that in the media, I mean, as you rightly said before, by example, in France, you had Humanité and you had Figaro, and you knew, I mean, the garbage was left out. That's absolutely true. But also, you knew where the opinionated part was clear. And I think what would be fantastic in 21st century media is to have the data on the one hand. What are the facts? Because nowadays, when you read a newspaper article, they don't always tell you what are the facts. So, sometimes we don't know, and so on and so on. But they kind of like mixed to pump up the energy and the emotions and the clicks. Yeah. Obviously, they mix the facts with the opinions. And that, to me, that's really a huge problem, because like, if you could report the basic facts, those are the sources, put that in perspective, long-term trends and so on, and then give an opinion, that would be fantastic. I think people are craving for that.
I think that's very astute. And I think that is what they're intending to do, but I'll ask them the next time we have a board call. But that is, I believe that's the intention. The original idea was to try and give facts only. And the problem is people dispute the facts unless they see what the opinion is. You have to do both. And I agree with you on that. By the way, Pascal, you mentioned something earlier, which is Bosch's exit from the autonomous vehicle sector. And we've seen the same thing happening with EVs in Mercedes and BMW, where they're backing off a little bit. And I was super pleased to see that the new, there's a series of new 911s coming out with more manual gearboxes when they said they were going to go all automatic. And Porsche, of course, owned by Volkswagen, who are suffering from all sorts of political pressures over the last 10 years after the diesel scandal, are suffering badly because the Macan, which they made 100% electric, is selling super badly. It's like 20-30% down last year when you had mixed models. So I think there are big changes happening in the automobile market, as an example, which people can relate to, which we're seeing everywhere. We pay attention to cars because we're all guys and we all like cars. Other people pay attention to different things. But it's that sort of give and take in how far people push things is happening. By the way, that's not just Youness because of the election. There has been as people have less money, they can afford the social ideas less. Right? When life is tough and we have less money in the bank, we spend more time worrying about whether we can pay for dinner for the next 3 weeks than whether someone else is wearing my hairstyle and they're appropriating my culture. Right? Your concerns switch to reality rather than some of the odd stuff that we've had over the last 10 years. But I think that's what makes it really interesting. Most car companies still think they're producing an electric car when they're doing an electric vehicle. Tesla produces a computer on wheels, right? It's not the same thing. The attitude is not the same, and their intention is not the same. And even though, again, I can say this, you can say this, other people may have said it, and so the car companies can clearly read it, they have a filter for things, the way they see things, the way they write things, which means they either can't implement something to take advantage of that understanding, because that's the way we do things around here, and it's very hard to change minds, or they just don't read it because they're only reading the press they want to read. But the result is they will not work in this space. It will not work. Now, I don't think that means the end of the internal combustion engine, by the way. It was interesting to see, was it Toyota who came out 10 days ago with a hydrogen engine which reduces, which was finally efficient enough to work in cars and safe enough that obviously its output is water, right? So you hydrogen in and then H2O comes out mixed with oxygen, which is great. So absolutely sustainable in many ways. And frankly, hydrogen is easier and cheaper to produce, depending on the quantity levels, than electricity, which requires burning coal or oil or something, because that's where the electricity comes from. So, but the changes taking place are fascinating. And again, it's back to that life cycle thing. Bosch adjusts. It'll be interesting to see how well they adjust. Will they survive or not? Will they be one of the 15 to 18 companies that survive longer term, or will they go the way of someone else and when new companies come along? Tesla, by the way, obviously Elon Musk is an interesting and slightly odd person in some ways, maybe on the spectrum, as his mother said. Obviously still brilliant, and obviously an amazing engineer, and obviously transforming the world. So I say good luck to him, subject to other things. If I'm concerned about one thing, it's he's doing a lot of things, which makes me worry that he'll take his eye off the ball of some of the things that are really cool and interesting. I like everybody, was super impressed with the chopstick pickup of the launch pad, the launcher that came down from the rocket from space. That was just very impressive engineering. And I know far too many people to have Teslas to criticize them. I think they still suffer from being a geek's car rather than anything else, but they're super impressive. And I like, I'm happy to be driven around in them. I'm just a car guy, so I prefer cars that feel more like cars. But I guess I won't be able to drive soon because it'll all be automated. The only way to avoid accidents actually in an automated environment is to take away people from the system. Because if they're 100% automated, did anybody see the movie iRobot, where all the cars are automated? And they were all branded Audi, by the way. It was good branding. If the cars are all automatic, they talk to each other, and that eliminates the accident problem. If the automated car has to watch out for pedestrians and human-driven cars, that's an issue because they don't know what the human-driven car is going to do, and there's no communication between the two. But when they're all automated, there's no way they hit each other because they all talk to each other constantly. And that's probably what will happen in the cities. I expect cities to ban cars and then switch to full automation at some point. And then there'll be no accidents. But then we won't be allowed to drive, which is a shame, but it's what I expect.
I'm not sure. I think it's like we're going to go towards this full automation, but then we're going to, my hope is that we're going to be allowed to drive 911 GT3 manual gearbox with the right engine, right? The real guy, the 3.8. But why? Because there will be so much automation. We're going to do that like kids compared to AI and automated robots, and they're going to protect us. An analogy I love is chess play. I don't know if you play chess, but Ding is trying is fighting Gukesh. So it's China against India now in the World Championship. And there's just like, I'm not a great chess player, but I love it. And my love for the game increased with AI winning. I just have no bloody way to be better than a program. But it's so much more interesting because I can understand how I play, how the others play, and I can see a party, a game with Ding and Gukesh and get something out of that. Otherwise, I would just be blind, right?
I agree.
My hope is that we can build a world where automation for the car sure makes things safe, and then we can drive like kids again.
I hope so, and it may be just on racetracks or in restricted areas, but we'll see. I do agree that AI, I mean, people are afraid of it because they don't know. It's a little bit like what caused the early Luddites, right? The Luddites were the group of people in the 18th century when new technology came along for the first time that they worried would destroy their lives. it's not going to replace per se. Certain jobs will go away, but it's not because they're replacing the work. It's because that every individual is able to leverage AI to do much more work than they could on their own. It's just a tool. It's like a robotic arm. It's something which is going to make many branches of work more efficient. It does eliminate admin. A lot of the admin stuff, we don't need people to do that anymore. And those jobs will go. But in general, life will be better. What is true, and this is always rough when there's lots of change, is that people are going to have to learn. Right? People are going to have to learn in companies, as individuals. The people often talk about lifelong learning. It's not an option. It's a necessity now. You have to be aware of the changes so that you adapt. Now, fortunately, people are adapting. If you think about the way people use their iPhones now and think about the way people used their iPhones 10 years ago, without realizing it, they're much more adept at playing with tech than they were. They've just, things have evolved over a period of time. And so everybody's learning to use the tech in better ways. Even my mother-in-law, who's 88, I think, has an iPhone, is able to use it and communicate and use WhatsApp and so on, which wouldn't have been possible if she'd been introduced to it even 10 years ago from scratch, but she's learned it over time. So I think I see AI as wonderfully positive for the most part. Now, AGI, as it's called, artificial general intelligence, which is basically artificial humanity. I think, and I've been watching this since I studied computer science at university, so I've been watching the space for a while. I read Gödel Eichenberger when it came out in '79, so I've read a lot and followed a lot in what's happening in the machine learning and AI space for 40 years now, more than 40 years. So I think we're probably a way away from real artificial general intelligence. And I worry less about artificial humanity taking over the world Terminator style than I do about some foolish human making a mistake with the technology and allowing or encouraging a machine to push a button that it shouldn't. I think it's going to be human error which creates the problem before it's a machine doing it by itself. And the only reason, by the way, I'm hesitant in the way I say these things is because the gentleman who just won the Nobel Prize, who was ex-Google and is now independent, Geoffrey Hinton, who should know about these things because he helped develop the neural network software algorithms which take the data we feed in to come up with the answers based on inputs by third parties. He has talked about publicly in various forums, post-Nobel Prize win, how the algorithms are doing things that the people who design the algorithms don't understand. Right? So for those who are listening, all of artificial intelligence today is simply pattern recognition. You feed data into a machine, you tell the machine what the data is, and over time, as you feed in thousands, 100,000, millions of versions of it, whether it's a photograph or words or paragraphs, it learns to recognize what something is from its early understanding. And after a while, it teaches itself because it's able to recognize subtleties that we as humans can't, which is why it's so good at doing diagnostics, right? You can put a naked individual in front of a scanner now, and the AI diagnostics machines do a better job than 99% of doctors, which is a good thing for all of us, but a little scary. It's still pattern recognition. It knows what lesions on a face look like. It knows what slightly misplaced eyes look like. It knows what skin formed in a certain way looks like. So it's able to, it's recognizing from a pattern it's been told. If you put something in front of an engine like that it's not seen very much of, the answer it comes back with won't be very good. Whereas if it's something that you've put a lot into it, the answer will be better. If you ask it a question or give it a piece of data that it's never seen before, its probability of coming up with a correct answer is almost zero. But it's only almost. And the stuff that Geoffrey Hinton was concerned about was they're throwing some questions into engines that they've created, and they're coming up with good answers when they can't imagine how they worked that out, because no data went into beforehand to feed it that. So that's the one thing. Hinton thinks that even the neural network-based large language model engines that they currently have might turn into something that resembles real intelligence, in other words, an ability to judge within a 5 to 10 year period. And the other stream of thought in the space is that there's something special about the way we judge and think forward and imagine and create, which is not just matching patterns from the past and combining things like what we've already seen, but actually origination of ideas, that maybe that involves a need for biology. So that's where the biocomputing side comes in, but they think it needs another step function improvement. That's interesting. So my only hesitation in the AI space is concern about foolish humans doing silly things, more than Terminator style robots. But I wonder about where we are on the path to real intelligence created artificially. I think it was Kai-Fu Lee in Taiwan who's been investing in AI for a long time. He came to our 25th anniversary of Wired. He used to say that he started in the space 35 years ago, like I did, although he stayed actively in the space, and almost nothing happened for 25 years, right? And then suddenly the last 5 years it's done this. So that step function change could happen again, and that's interesting. So I'm generally optimistic and positive about everything that's related to AI, with the slight concern that if the smartest person in the space who's just won a Nobel Prize doesn't know how it's working, that's worth thinking about.
I totally agree. I think we should listen a lot. I mean, I made a comment on LinkedIn the other day because the guy was all over the place, all enthusiastic about mixing CRISPR. So that's how you can edit genome, so DNA, so biology, so real living organism, and combine that with AI. We know from DeepMind that they can predict folding of proteins and so on. And I made a comment and I said, like, yeah, sure, that's gonna maybe solve some rare disease and so on. But look at the flip side. I mean, as long as you're in the information space, okay, that could be scary, but I feel okay-ish, right? That's okay-ish. But if you go from the world of the bits to the world of the atoms, and you just, enable the fact you can invent new form of life, then that's truly scary, because then we just don't know what we're doing, and the imprint on the earth and on us that's going to last forever. So that, to me, that's really the scary part. It's like when you mix that with the atoms and the biology, then we should, EU would be better to legislate on that one than on, trying to kill all startup in EU with stupid regulation beforehand.
Well, yeah. So yes, I agree. It's an interesting space, and biocomputing is one of those fun areas. I will say that I don't think more legislation or regulation by people who have no idea is a good idea. The people who, the idea of regulation in itself, protect society from itself, is not a bad thing. But the people they end up putting in charge of doing that are usually not, frankly, qualified to make those decisions. And then the people who vote on it take the word of the people who are not qualified to make the decisions as to what they should do, and the regulation ends up being wrong. And that's the history of the EU, and it's why innovation doesn't happen here. So do we need to protect ourselves from ourselves? Yes. Do I think that governments are the right people to do this? No. No. Personal bias.
I agree. We had so much fun on the podcast because we noticed the news, and EU is offering a guichet unique. So it's a one-stop shop, and they will help you with AI. Good luck with that. And, we had so much fun because they have a hard time recruiting great people.
I wonder why.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, okay.
That's very interesting. So the discussion that we are having about AI, and we spoke about it a couple of weeks ago, that the DoD, the Department of Defense, has classified it as the third greatest advancement for their offset strategy, the military strategy. So in that part, so you have a new elected president, Mr. Trump, that has this tagline, America First. At the same time, like 90% or 100% of the drones that the US military are using are from China. There is this trade war with China, tech war with China. You've lived in China, you have experienced like other countries from the BRICS. How do you see the next few years, or at least the next 4 years, in terms of like a trade or competition between these countries?
Fascinating. I mean, it's going to be really interesting. As I said, I wish I was 30 again. So for the listeners, it's a reminder that the biggest trade partners in the world are, in fact, Europe, China, and the US. So trade between those three countries is a large chunk of what happens in the world, just because of the capital, the size of the markets, the amount of money that's involved. And by the way, most of it's in US dollars, which gives the Americans an advantage in many ways. So we aren't likely to lock down the world. We are seeing multi-polarization. So since the Second World War, the world has been heading towards being a single global market for things, right? Globalization, that term, meant that you could be in England or you could be in Geneva and order your coffee from Brazil or East Africa. You could have your computers come in from the United States. You could have your wine come in from France. You could have your borscht or vodka come in from Russia. And that was how the world worked. And the systems were set up in place so that it was efficient, straightforward, and it didn't cost you that much. And it's extraordinary. I mean, frankly, the idea that people are taking water from a fountain off the mountain in France, in Evian, putting it in a plastic bottle, shipping it around the world to China, supposedly one of the poorer countries when they started doing this 30 years ago, and people are paying for that water and you can do it efficiently, is extraordinary. I mean, that the degree to which globalization has worked for everybody, so we can all get access to almost anything we want at any time. And I know that there are people in the global south where this is not the truth. But if you look at the numbers, it's a lot fewer than it was 10 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. And I think people tend to be overwhelmed by the negativity in the press when the truth of the statistics of how the world is doing is that we've never been better. So that's an aside. But yes, anything which therefore creates frictions in the marketplace, whether it's tariffs or bans on exporting certain technologies or discouraging companies to invest in certain regions. I mean, China, remember, has done incredibly well over the last 30 years since Deng Xiaoping's march and discussions and statements about opening up, partly because of a growing, energetic, hungry population and huge amounts of foreign direct investment, FDI, going into the country. Right? The capital is part of what funded. So capital and understanding plus the natural drive of the Chinese population have created the Chinese miracle that is today. So any frictions that come in to restrict that will make things more difficult. Now, what do I mean by that? Things will get more expensive. Right? Tariffs increase the costs for people in the US as well as anywhere else. Everything gets a little bit more expensive, which means it encourages inflation rather than reduces it. Now, there is some argument that if you make things more expensive, people buy less, so the prices can go back down again. There's another argument that says if you create tariffs in the United States to make certain goods more expensive in the United States, then there'll be fewer dollars leaving the US, or more dollars retained in the US. The dollar gets stronger, which means that the things being imported are cheaper. So you put tariffs on them, but the US dollar is rising against those other currencies, and so the price is neutral for the people in the country. That may be over the midterm. Over the short term, things get expensive with tariffs. So I think there are, and that's just one example of a lot of things that may or may not happen. So why am I not worried about it? Because I'm not. In the first instance, although countries define policy, it is companies that make things happen. So the country can say, you shouldn't invest in China, Vietnam's okay. The company will find the best way to efficiently produce its product and services to get it back to whoever their customers are. A country can decide that we're not going to allow the best chips we have to be exported to China. Huawei then produces its own equivalent. It may not be quite as good, but it's enough. And so innovation happens elsewhere. So it might have had a bigger impact pre-internet. Pascal, back to the question about how easily information flows and ideas flow. But now with the communication systems we have and the ability to understand how to do things in a way that we couldn't before, I think that the impact of government policies on these things is less than it might be. And I'm also quite optimistic about corporations' ability to work their way around or through things to make things work. However, having said that, at the limit, à la limite, at the margin in English, we are going to see slightly higher costs. Right? So ESG in general create slightly higher costs. Sustainability goals create slightly higher costs as it currently stands because new technologies have to be developed, new systems have to be created to do things. People often think that oil is going to go away because we'll replace it with sustainable energy. That's not going to happen anytime soon. Never in the history of mankind have we ever replaced an energy source. We've just added to the energy sources. We keep using the old ones, and the increased demand because of the population growth takes care of the new sources, and we bring it in. AI, of course, heavily energy dependent. Much technology actually heavily energy dependent. So I don't think that changes, but that means demand is high. So again, price of fuel doesn't drop; it stays up. So I think we're going to see slightly higher inflation than people expect. I think it's come down, obviously, from the silly numbers it was post-COVID. I don't think it goes down to 0 or 1%. I think it stays a little bit higher, which means interest rates are a little higher, which means costs are a little bit higher for borrowing money. So I think the impacts are subtle impacts of everything being slightly more expensive, slightly slower. Does the world come to an end? No. Does it mean we can't travel anywhere? No, maybe not Russia, but other places will be fine. Does it mean there'll be more danger on the streets? Perhaps. When you have wars going on someplace and it's religion-based, you will get fanatics in other countries who follow the same religion that might do things that they shouldn't in their home country. So maybe there'll be more incidents like that. I lived in Paris during the bombings in the Jewish Quarter in the 1980s. So, but I don't see, for the most part, a high probability of disaster. Now, there is a small probability of a human mistake, right? There's a small probability of a human error, which by a leader or by someone who controls a button they shouldn't, of escalation of war, either in Eastern Europe or in the Middle East. That's possible. I don't think it's a high probability. I think people don't realize how much communication that goes on behind the scenes. So the chance of that happening are low, but it exists. It exists. People have been predicting for a long, long time an Islam against Europe war. I think the more likely thing is, as we've seen, war amongst the Middle Eastern states on their own because there's so much disagreement regionally. But that could expand. Do I think China's going to invade Taiwan? Most Chinese governing people don't want to. President Xi did make statements about unification of China when he was rising, 2010 period. And he has been embarrassed by some of the criticism of the government's handling of the COVID crisis internally. And so as he reaches the end of his extended term, you're only supposed to be president for 2 terms in China, he changed the rules so he could be elected for 3, taking a page out of Putin's book. And that maybe he'll do something silly and say, before he dies, he wants this legacy to happen, so he'll order the invasion when it shouldn't happen. But I don't think it's likely. So a lot of the stuff that people worry about, that they write about, that makes good headlines, I'm generally not worried about. But yes, the possibilities are there for problems. I think I'm much more excited about the positive things. I see so many startups. Both in Europe and the US and in China, frankly. I still have relationships in China from the time we spent living there, that make me quite excited about the fun we're going to have over the next 10 years. I hope I'm around to see some of it, but no, I'm not as negative as the press might suggest. Yes, the possibility of problems exist. I just don't think they're high probability.
That's if I can quote you, fun for the next 10 years. That's awesome. I totally agree. Totally agree.
It's exciting times. It's just, almost every month I read something or see something or receive something which goes, wow, that's going to be interesting when it comes out, if it works. So.
Yeah. How do you see the as you mentioned, the next 10 years for the BRICS?
Boy, that depends on so many things. It really depends on so many things. China has a population which is slowing. It has less FDI. It has a more belligerent government. So China clearly is not going to grow, is already not growing as fast as it has done over the last 30 years. Right? So China's slowing. They're already talking about peaking population in China. And people argue whether it's 2030 or 2050, but that's happening. Partly one-child policy, partly the fact that young women don't see a need to marry a young man. They want to get rich themselves and have independence. India population still growing. Caste system theoretically not a problem since Modi is president, but I hear about problems all the time. So it has its own impediments to growth in terms of its ability to manage technology and processes and businesses. But population is still rising. I think India's having this, therefore this is on this uptick as China suffers. Africa's a tragedy. There's so much potential in Africa. Obviously, they have natural resources. Obviously, they have some smart people, and they have good schools, and we see good people coming out of it. But the governance of countries in Africa is non-stop disaster. It's sad how many bad stories we hear about countries in the African subcontinent. It's just a tragedy. Middle East, I'll come back to in a sec. Latin America, again, you have this history of oscillating governments left and right. You have this history of governments going bankrupt because they spend too much money or borrow too much and they can't pay it back. Argentina being the best example. What is it? 10 company failures to pay back loans in the last 100 years. So there are many things which are regionally specific, which create cultural problems. Pascal, your point earlier about culture trumps strategy all the time. People can come up with great strategies for changing a nation, but if the culture isn't there to facilitate it, it doesn't get anywhere. If I was going to make one comment that might affect everything, the dollar, as I said earlier, is the currency of choice for almost all global trade. It's declined over the last 10 years, and obviously some of the BRICS countries, particularly Russia and China, have talked about trying to replace the dollar as a trade thing. But in the end, they don't trust each other. So China isn't going to accept rubles for payment of products, and Russia's not going to accept RMB for payment of fuel that they're shipping to China for very long, because the dollar is the only thing that's relatively safe and doesn't fall in value as fast as the others. Now, let's be clear, the dollar's lost 99% of its value. People can go look up where that number comes from, but literally 99% of its value since the turn of the 19th and 20th century to date. What you could buy with a penny then, you could buy with $1 now. It's just tragic. But that's a much slower rate than other currencies. What is it? Egypt's devalued 50% twice in the last 4 years. So the dollar is still the best of what are essentially bad currencies. Now, the dollar is currently rising. It's been falling steadily for many years, but at the moment it's rising. So you talked about the next 5 to 10 year period. Some of the policies that Trump is talking about, let's see if he does it, will help make the dollar rise. Why is that a problem for emerging markets, for the BRICS countries? If you're a wealthy country, so that means the West, and that means therefore Europe and the US, and you're lending money and you feel like lending money to countries that are asking for it, do you think you're going to go and buy Argentinian peso and lend in pesos and accept the money being paid back in pesos in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, when the probability is the peso will have fallen in value another 35%? No. You're going to lend in dollars and you want to be paid back in dollars. So all of the countries with relatively weak currencies, and that means all of the BRICS, China less than most, but that's partly because they control their capital account, right? You can't take RMB out. If RMB was a free-floating currency, it wouldn't be as high as it is. But if for everybody else who has a free-floating currency and need to borrow, to build, to borrow, to grow, they borrow in dollars, right? So they borrow, say they borrow $1 million, make the number simple, and they pay their 5% or whatever the interest rates are. First of all, the interest rates used to be a lot lower, right, in dollars. Now they've gone up and they're coming down, but they're not coming down a lot. Suddenly the amount of money you have to pay back in dollars is higher than it was because the interest rates are higher. But there's a second component. If you're Argentina and you're borrowing in dollars, how do you pay that money back? Well, you have to buy dollars to pay it back. If your currency is falling, the dollar's rising, and it's rising faster than it was before, then the amount you have to pay back is much higher than it was. So back to your question specifically, Youness, whilst there are culturally specific concerns for different regions and different countries in the BRICS that affect their ability to grow and affect their ability to manage themselves, and obviously there have been a couple of positive points in Latin America over the last few years in terms of competent management, the one overriding factor that affects all BRICS is the dollar as the reserve currency for trade and for borrowing in the BRICS countries. And if the dollar rises, that makes the ability to generate foreign capital for investment purposes for building their own countries harder. Now, right at the moment, the BRICS companies are doing well. I've been watching Embraer, the airline company in Brazil, for ages, and it's done nothing but fall. And so I haven't invested. If you look at the last 6 months, it's done this. And that's partly because investment moves out of the overpriced Americas and then comes to Latin America and other places. So the markets look like they're doing well, and people are recommending people to expose themselves to investments in those areas. But I'm talking about the economy that underlies that market. And I think there may be challenges because of the US dollar and because of some other things that are happening.
So in your opinion, who should be handling the politics? Because there is like this big shift in terms of capabilities to run the government, and we're seeing the reaction even in Switzerland, where some people they are saying, oh, we should have like a more Elon Musk running the government. And you just mentioned that in these BRIC countries, there are some very good companies doing something good, but it's slowing down maybe with bad politics. So do you think that there might be like a shift in terms of who should be running the government, and we could see like an Elon Musk in India or in Switzerland and trying to change things?
So again, these are very big questions, and I try to give answers which I'm going to get shot at because I make generalizations.
Nobody's going to be listening.
I'm attempting to provide you with answers that are hopefully helpful to people. CEOs run companies to certain parameters. They run companies based on their wish to create products and services and serve markets and generate money for themselves. You don't necessarily want a CEO to run a government, right? Just because they can run a company, given the parameters and the targets and the processes they have internally, doesn't mean they can run a country. Processes are different. The goals are different. The people are different. So competence in running a company does not mean you necessarily have competence in running a country. Now, I wouldn't want to run a country for anything for all the money on the planet. It must be a nightmare to do. You don't have the people you want. The processes are messy. Goals are unclear a lot of the time, which allows people to cheat within the system. I mean, it's not fun at all. So I think the talent required to run a country isn't necessarily the same. I mean, there are overlaps, but it's not necessarily the same as what you need to run a country, run a company. I do think, unfortunately, I say unfortunately because this is the hard bit. If you want good governance in a country, you have to change the population. And if you want to change the population, you have to educate them. And if you want to educate them, you need time. The US policy in the Middle East for some time was to lop off the head of governments where they didn't like what they were doing. But all you do, I mean, most countries, this is something people don't like to hear, most countries get the governance they deserve, right? They get the governance that the culture creates. So you can change the person at the top, but if you don't change the system, you get the same results. Maybe a little bit shifted this way, a little bit shifted that way, but unless the system changes, you don't get major change. So I don't expect to see radical change in the way countries are run over the next 10, 15, 20 years, because it only happens if culture changes, and culture only changes with education. I don't just mean education in schools, I mean education in families, about how we live, how we do things, how we behave. We talked about at the beginning of Wired how with this democratization of access to both publishing information and receiving, reading information, that it would be easier for people to see how other people lived. And maybe we would take the best of how other people lived and change the way we live. I think that's happening to a degree. I think it's easier for people to see how other people live. Unfortunately, it's also easy to see if other people are rich and you're poor, so people feel bad because somebody else has more. But if you're open to new inputs, I think the internet has helped people gain an understanding of how different cultures live, which is why places like Russia and China restrict access to the internet, because they don't want people to see that maybe their system has faults. But if people are open to it, I think the internet has contributed to understanding and learning more broadly. But it's slow. This stuff takes a long, long time. Changing cultures takes a long, long time. So I don't expect radical change in the way countries are run and therefore how the globe works. Unless there's a massive outside shock, all right? So invasion from outer space, people might work together. The sudden arrival of sentient technology, which then threatens all of us. Okay, maybe we'll start working together. But in the meantime, you know, this is the way we do things around here. We don't want to change. And, you know, a lot of the time I like that. I like the variety of cultures, for example, we have in Europe. I like the different foods, the different approaches, different attitudes, the different ways of solving problems. One of the nice things about doing an MBA, an international MBA, is if you're 3 o'clock in the morning, you're trying to get a presentation done for the morning, you've got 6 people from 6 different countries in the room trying to solve this problem. And you learn very quickly. They all think differently. They're all bright, but they all think differently. That's the richness of the world. That's the stuff that's fun about the world. So I don't mind the fact that we have this variety of cultures. But if you're talking about how the economies will do based on governance, I don't think you can change the head of a governing system and expect change. The system has to be changed itself.
Oh, thanks a lot for sharing that. That's also, I mean, having gone through IMD, I did an MTE, a short program, managing technology enterprises. One of the things people don't realize maybe when they are on the outside is that one of the things that strikes at IMD is that you have a very high level of high quality people. All the students, the professors, and so on. Even like the admin lady welcoming you on campus, she'll have a like, hey, how can I help, right? And it puts you in a juice, in a soup, where excellence is of essence. And they make your life complex because it's never as simple as you thought. So you're always pushed to re-engineer the thing. And I think one of the things we should think about is like how you could engineer this continuous learning thing, not only for, you know, people who can afford or, you know, have the ability to do that, but at a larger pace for globally for the society, right? I mean, to me, that's really a key, because if you're privileged enough to have spent a few weeks or a few years on IMD campus, you kind of like, it's like a tattoo you get in the neck. You can, you know, it gives you juice for life. I mean, truly, it's like super kerosene that nurtures you. And even if you've not covered the topic during the scholarship, you're going to be able to apply that attitude to other domains. So that's really so precious. And I've long thought about that. I've no clue on how to apply that to a general population, but I agree with you. That's kind of the key. Unlike, I mean, I'm kind of hopeful that with AI and LLMs, we could kind of like buy some kind of agent companion stuff that kind of like gets with you and kind of challenges you, right? That's one of the remarkable things with IMD professors. It's like you tell them something and it's kind of okay-ish, and they will be like, yeah, sure. Now look at the other side of the argument. So you're never alone. They never let you think you got it right, which is how the real world works, right? In the end, you're never truly right. So I think it's a big theme for democracies nowadays. And I think what is going to make difference is the openness to new ideas. We need to get robust to, you know, I think in universities and whatever, we should be confronted very harshly to whatever truth there is out there and be challenged and get, you know, build a harder skin rather than trying to, you know, take care of. I don't say you have to neglect minorities and so on, but if there is one moment in time where you have to learn how, you know, how to face different arguments, that's truly university.
I'm afraid I agree. I think it's one of the tragedies of the last 10, 20 years is the weaknesses in the culture of universities.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an answer or a comment that tackles both what you started with and what you finished with. In general, it's happening, right? So I am already seeing AI agents for education. I care a great deal about the education space. My wife and I almost started a school group. So the ability of education platforms to pitch the level of education at the level of the person interacting is already starting. And I've seen the impact on individuals, and it's tremendous. We still design classrooms, this is true, by the way, at IMD or at a high school, at the average of the class, maybe a little bit higher, a little bit lower, depending on the culture of the school. And that means that the people who are bright aboard and the people who are struggling, struggle. If agents are used for the conveyance of learning, and by the way, education is the one area where it's the easiest to use AI agents currently, because it's all about received knowledge. It's not about new, it's about what people know. I've watched, by the way, with voice now. It's super impressive when it's actually a visual implementation with real-time voice. Interact with kids on questions and draw people out. And I've watched the same model vary its output based on the age and IQ of the kid in front of them. I think that's happening. It's super impressive. The second thing that's happening is access to information. So what we started at Wired 30 years ago is obviously increasing through AI. The ability of great schools to create courses that anybody can get access to is both becoming widespread, but also a lot of it's free, right? The number of universities, but other education institutions also that provide knowledge online for anybody who's willing to self-learn and try it themselves is extraordinary compared with 30 years ago, just extraordinary. I mean, there are things like the Khan Academy, which are created by individuals outside the university structure, but also Stanford and others have offered on Coursera extraordinary numbers. And this is not just the inexpensive or simple courses. These are really tough, interesting courses online for free for a lot of people. And I think that continued access to information and understanding is a big plus. Youness, back to your point about the bricks, that anybody can get access to as long as they have an internet connection on a halfway decent computer. So that makes me super optimistic. I think that AI impact on education, as long as it's not corrupted with bad inputs, as long as people find good courseware, is going to be hugely positive for humanity generally. And I think that is the sort of thing that helps change cultures and educate and bring cultures along. I think that will happen. I think we'll be surprised sometimes about where the sources are. And again, we've got this problem about whether people are manipulating sources. We are going to need to use AI for verification of knowledge and sources as much as we are for origination and creation of content. But I'm assuming that will happen. There's enough people interested in making it work and enough people interested in selling subjects, selling solutions, that they need to provide solutions for this problem about bad sourcing of content or bad sourcing of political views. I think it'll be there. But so I'm education and healthcare are the two areas I'm most optimistic about near-term applications of machine learning and artificial intelligence, because I've seen them, because I've seen the diagnostics engines and I've seen the teaching modules, and I love it. It's great. So and again, this can be taken anywhere. These things can be used in Africa, in Latin America, as much as they can be used in Geneva and New York. So.
And I want to jump on the fact that so both of you are quite optimistic about the use of AI and the LLMs to learn new things, but you also on the other hand you have the behavior of people, like the bad use of technology, especially the young generation. They prefer to spend,
not just the young,
even the older one. They prefer to spend time on TikTok or on other social platforms. And I know that you have taken a role at the Toledo Museum. So even this art part, which is something very strong for the culture, the how you built yourself, you see at the history, there is a decline in it, So what's your take, and can you also explain us a bit more about what you do at the Toledo? And because for me it's like you are a tech guys, you're very much advanced techie guy, and you went into art, which is like not the most innovative industry, and so I want to have your take on that.
So first of all, if you look at my CV, if you look at my LinkedIn profile, it does look like it's all over the place. But there are threads, right? So art and culture is one thread. Both the photography plus what's not on there is my mother was a gallerist and a collector of Oriental art. So some of the things you see in the room here are from Mom's collection, who sadly passed away some time back. I grew up in a house with art. I grew up in a house, and I grew up going to museums and art galleries and things. So I've always had that interest personally, and it's part of what fed my time as a photographer. I never really cared about the clients I had. I cared about making an image that made people think, made people reflect. And I still do that on the Instagram pages, which I do for myself, so I don't post all the time. It's not for anybody else, but it's fun to do. So my interest has always been there in art, and you'll see peppered in you'll even see on my LinkedIn profile, there was something called Art World Salon, which I started with Mark Spiegler, who ended up being the director of Art Basel, and Andrea Santo, who ran the Sotheby's Institute in New York. So I've been involved with people in there, and I'm currently, I haven't put it on the CV yet, but it's I'm currently on the Digital Arts Council of Art Basel at the moment. Mark has now left, there's someone else running it, but they asked me to help out. So my interest has always been there. Some time ago, the current director of the Toledo Museum of Art, who's a very unusual, very able, very bright young man, young by the standards of museum directors. He was a Rhodes Scholar and did his PhD in art history at Oxford, and he was put in touch with me by by someone else I knew in the art world, because he had something which he'd been making that he was thinking about selling, and I helped him think about deal structure and what buyers want, and what he could do, and what the pricing would be. And we stayed in touch from that point. And off and on, he would call me up and say, "Ian, what do you think about this?" Or "What do you think about that?" Because I've become, I guess, as a guy with gray hair, a futurist. So people ask me questions to give them perspective on what might happen in their sector. And since I care about the art space, I gave him responses in answer to his questions about the art space and museums in particular that he wasn't expecting. And that started a more detailed conversation. And at some point, again, he's bright, he can work this out for himself. But the reason people hire consultants in is because their board won't listen to them, because they listen to them every day. So you hire a consultant in to tell them stuff that you've already told the board, but because the consultant has gray hair, the board listens. So that's partly the role that I play at the museum. And joking aside, I also try to provide perspective on stuff that's going on. So I started just as their advisor on the future of museums. Because as you intimated earlier, and as I mentioned to you in RT, the average age of museum goers is falling. I beg your pardon, rising. Because people under 30 don't go into a museum unless they're dragged in by their parents or an art teacher. And it's not because museums are less attractive, it's that there are other things that are more attractive. Their phones, their screens provide them with access to entertainment, information, art of the type that they want. And they don't have to walk across town and walk into a building with columns and high ceilings and too cold air conditioning. So it's a different world. And the same is true, by the way, the classrooms, right? We design classrooms based on a Cartesian approach to education, which is standardized, one person, a blackboard, chalk, and 25 people in a room having to follow. There's no personalization of that. And in the same way, there's no personalization of museum experiences. So museums have a question as to whether they will still be relevant in 30 years' time. Well, never mind 30 years, 10 years' time. Right? If our average age of museum goers is rising and they're dying and fewer children are going in, fewer kids are going in, what's the place of a museum? So I think the place of a museum is similar to that of a school. It's a source of knowledge and understanding and learning. It's a place where you get cultural perspective, historical perspective on who you are and who the people around you are. I think they're vital. I think they're also a really easy way in one afternoon, in a 1 hour trip or a 3 hour trip, depending on your proclivities, to get a really good sense of the world. I mean, of its history. And I think that's tremendous. The Toledo Museum of Art is a museum of art, particularly. It's not a general museum, it's art. So we have pictures, sculptures, but also digital works and videos and other things. Where if you walk around slowly an afternoon, your perspective on the world can change. I think that's important. I think it's great. I think it's valuable. So the question is, how do we bring that knowledge and understanding and the works that are in there? How do we help new generations appreciate it, learn from it? And that's the role. I started as an outside advisor. Now I've become director of TMA Laboratories, the Toledo Museum of Art Laboratories Labs. And we have a team that's playing with technology to try out things and do things. We also have an artist in residence program, a digital artist in residence program, which is unusual for a museum, where we take a contemporary artist doing interesting things, using technology in interesting ways, not just NFTs, although the first two have produced NFTs. NFT is just a medium. It may or may not survive. But the work that's being done in digital is different from the work that gets done in physical. And you can convey things differently. The interaction is different. So you can reach different people. And because so much of what our youth are using for their understanding of culture is digital, I think that offers us a chance to reach new audiences in new ways. And the results so far have been good. We've just confirmed behind the scenes who our digital artist in residence will be for next year. We're not announcing it yet. But the first two have been hugely successful, and people have said lots of nice things, and people are excited by it, and it's attracted audiences. So to answer your question again, Youness, to just finish on this bit, and by all means ask detail if you wish. The Toledo Museum of Art is an unusually good museum. I wouldn't have accepted this job if I didn't think Adam was tremendous as an individual. And also because the collection is very unusual. It was founded by a very wealthy person in the days when money was worth much, much more. So it's a small museum in a small town, but the museum collection is very high quality. I travel around museums in Europe a lot of the time, and there are museums funded by industrialists in Germany and France. And every museum wants to have one of everything, right? They want their own Manet, Monet, Van Gogh, and everything else. But because they have limited budgets, and because it's, no one goes into these places, I'm being slightly unkind here, but fewer people go into them. The one of everything's not very good. The one of everything inside the Toledo Museum of Art is world class. They don't buy if it's not one of the top 3 pieces available. And so the quality of the museum, the quality of the staff is what brought me there. And I think it's a very good place to experiment with ways to think about how to make sure that museums have a future. And I'm not worried about Toledo because of the people and because of the collection. But what we learn there will be useful more broadly. Again, to be clear, if you're the Louvre in Paris or MoMA in New York or the Met, people go automatically because it's on a tick box list of places you have to visit when you go there. But that doesn't mean they appreciate what's in there. Right? So I had a friend of mine who was taking his daughter on from London to a museum tour. I beg your pardon, not a museum tour, a school tour, a university tour in the US. And his daughter said, I want to visit MoMA. And the dad was super excited because, that's great because he's an art collector. It's how I know him. And he thought, his daughter was gaining an appreciation for the art world, which he was really pleased about. So they get to New York and they walk from their hotel and they're in the lobby of the MoMA, and daughter asked daddy to take a picture in front of the sign with MoMA. And they do that. And then she says, okay, we can go now. And, the father was crestfallen. And it was just tick box. So just because the young do enter MoMA, the Met, and the Louvre doesn't mean that they have the appreciation for what's in there and what they can learn from it that I think is good for people. So I think the lessons we learn at TMA will be useful globally for museums and arts institutions globally.
Oh, that's awesome. Honestly, thanks a lot for doing that, because I think it's super important. Don't you think people after 30, they start craving for art? Because that nurtures your soul, right? So
more.
I mean, I studied in Switzerland, and we studied the best literature available. And I was, I was not 18 years old, and I just it was a massacre. I just did not get why we would be exposed to that. And my intuition is that it comes later in life, and at some point you start getting into the habit of nurturing your life and your soul with such things you could not express otherwise, right? That's what art is meant for. But I think trying to help them is very exciting. You'll reinvent museum like you did with newspaper.
We'll see. Cool. We'll see if we manage it. But I agree that in general, in the past, when you're 20s, you're busy partying, trying to develop your career, trying to build something. You don't have time. As you get older, you spend more time with museums. And they're nice places to go for walks, right? To reflect, to think. A lot of people use museums just for that. I used to go into museums just to walk. When I lived in Paris, I would walk through the halls of the Louvre because it made me peaceful and calm as I tried to think through a problem. But that still requires a habit. And I'm worried that, I'm hoping you're right, and I'm hoping it continues. But I'm worried that the 20-year-olds who don't walk into museums now won't think of a museum as the first place to go when they want to get an appreciation of art. I'm hoping they just don't go online and look at the pictures and the images there, or order it online for something for their living room. But yeah, we'll see. Fingers crossed.
I have one last question for you, Ian, to close the discussion. What question I should have asked you?
I don't think
that's a tricky one. Go ahead.
Right. So I'm gonna answer the question for you, rather than give you the question. I'm a technologist. I'm a futurist, of course, but I don't think that's what saves the world. If you want to save the world, I think a lot of the people that give themselves tasks of trying to save the world and make the world a better place, there's a need inside them which makes them wish to do this. And I'd rather they worked on that need inside them first. I think the world would be a better place if we all tried to be better people. I think the world would be a better place if we all did some personal development of our own to try and understand why we are who we are, what makes us tick, what makes us angry, what makes us sad. I think that stuff, psychology applied to self, is the best way to improve the world, each individual on their own. So the question to ask would be, what do you care about? What do you worry about? So I enjoy technology. I enjoy macro. I enjoy understanding things. I enjoy systems theory. I enjoy psychology in general. What do I worry about? Individuals being distracted. I think we as people, we as individuals, need to spend a little bit more time, all of us, on trying to understand ourselves and be better. That will save the world. It won't be the other things.
Thanks, Ian. Very, very, very much insightful. Really appreciate your time. Pascal, thanks as well. So that's it for me. And I wish you a great day, and thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks
Always
a
happy
lot,
to help.
Jan.
Take care, Pascal. Take care, Youness.